The first indication that humanity was different came not from our technology, our art, or our philosophy. It came from a single moment of absolute defiance that rippled across the galaxy like a shockwave, forever altering how the universe would view the species from the small blue world in the outer spiral arm. Commander Zeta. 9 of the Hegemony fleet had conquered 47 worlds. Each had followed the same pattern: initial resistance, strategic bombardment, negotiation, and finally, submission. The conquered species would integrate into the Hegemony's vast empire, contributing their unique abilities to the collective while accepting their place in the galactic hierarchy. It was efficient, it was logical, and it had worked without exception for over 3,000 years. Earth was supposed to be conquest number 48. The preliminary scans had been promising. The humans showed all the typical markers of a conquerable species. They fought among themselves, had primitive space technology, and lacked any unified planetary government. Their military capabilities appeared laughably inadequate compared to hegemony standards. Most encouraging of all, they seemed to possess the survival instinct common to all intelligent life, the fundamental drive to preserve existence at any cost. Zeta. 9 had been so confident that he'd planned to complete the subjugation within a single planetary rotation. The first assault began at dawn, over what humans called the North American continent. Hegemony forces descended from orbit with overwhelming force, their plasma weaponry turning human military installations to molten slag within minutes. Cities burned. Governments crumbled. Communications networks collapsed. Within 6 hours, all organized human resistance had been systematically eliminated. It should have been over. That's when Zeta 9 received a transmission from the surface that would haunt him for the rest of his considerably long life. The signal came from a human military facility that his forces had supposedly destroyed hours earlier. The voice was calm, steady, and carried an undertone that the universal translator struggled to convey, but that every predatory species in the galaxy would have recognized immediately. The sound of a cornered animal that had decided to take its attackers down with it. This is Colonel Sarah Mitchell, acting commander of Earth Defense Force. To the alien forces currently occupying our planet, you've made a fundamental error in judgment. You seem to believe that destroying our governments, our military bases, and our cities would make us surrender? You're wrong. You've just eliminated the only things that were holding us back. Zeta 9 activated his ship's tactical display, expecting to see scattered pockets of resistance that his ground forces could easily mop up. Instead, the readings showed something that made his 4 hearts skip in sequence. Human energy signatures were appearing everywhere, not the organized patterns of military units, but something far more dangerous: the chaotic, unpredictable heat blooms of individual humans who had stopped following any rules whatsoever. You want to know what humans are like when we stop pretending to be civilized? Mitchell's voice continued. When we stop caring about laws and treaties and the proper way to conduct warfare, you're about to find out. We have a saying here: the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. You've just helped us destroy our weak selves. The first indication of what this meant came from the ruins of Detroit. A squad of Hegemony soldiers, the elite Kronak Guard known for their impenetrable battle armor and devastating weapon systems, went silent during a routine patrol. When reinforcements arrived, they found the squad's remains scattered across 3 city blocks. The armor had been breached not by energy weapons or explosives, but by crude chemical devices that should never have been able to penetrate Kronak defenses. More disturbing was what they'd found written in human blood on a nearby wall: you can't kill what's already dead inside. Similar reports began flooding in from across the planet. Humans weren't fighting like any species the Hegemony had ever encountered. They weren't trying to preserve their infrastructure, protect their civilians, or maintain any semblance of organized resistance. Instead, they were fighting like they had nothing left to lose, because they had decided they didn't. In what had once been Tokyo, a single human female held off an entire Hegemony battalion for 18 hours, using nothing but improvised explosives and an intimate knowledge of the city's underground systems. She killed 47 soldiers before finally being overwhelmed. And even then, her last act was to trigger a chemical plant explosion that took out another 200. In the Amazon basin, humans began emerging from the jungle like vengeful spirits, using poison darts, pit traps, and ambush tactics that seemed to belong to an earlier era of warfare. But these weren't primitive weapons wielded by savage minds. They were precision instruments deployed by engineers, doctors, and teachers who had simply decided that the niceties of civilization were no longer relevant. The pattern was the same everywhere. Humans would appear from nowhere, strike with devastating effect, and then vanish back into the ruins of their world, leaving behind not just casualties but psychological wounds that ran deep into the hegemony force's collective psyche. But it was in the underground bunkers beneath what had been NORAD that Zeta-9 encountered the true horror of humanity unleashed. His personal guard had traced an emergency signal to a military complex buried deep within a mountain. They expected to find desperate survivors, perhaps important human leaders who could be captured and used to organize a surrender. Instead, they found something that would fundamentally alter how the galaxy understood the concept of warfare. The bunker was a maze of reinforced corridors and blast doors, all designed to protect the facility's occupants from nuclear attack. But the humans inside weren't using it as a shelter. They had turned it into the galaxy's most elaborate death trap. Every corridor was a killing field. Every doorway was a choke point. Every room was a carefully orchestrated ambush. The humans had rigged their own military base with enough explosives to level a small mountain, and they were systematically luring hegemony forces deeper into their trap. The defenders weren't soldiers anymore. They were something else entirely. They moved through the darkness like they belonged there, using guerrilla tactics that seemed to violate every principle of rational combat. They would sacrifice 10 of their own to kill a single hegemony soldier. They would detonate explosives while standing directly on top of them. They fought with the desperate fury of a species that had collectively decided that their lives meant nothing if their enemies could claim victory. It took Zeta-9's forces 3 days to clear the bunker. When they finally reached the command center, they found Colonel Mitchell waiting for them. She was wounded, exhausted, and surrounded by the bodies of her fallen comrades. But she was smiling. "Congratulations," she said, her hands resting on what Zeta-9's equipment identified as a massive explosive device. "You've successfully captured one underground military facility. Want to know how many more there are? Want to know how many humans are still out there, watching your every move, learning your tactics, planning your deaths?" Zeta-9 stepped forward, his weapon trained on the human commander. "You have lost. Your world is conquered. Surrender now and your species will be treated with the dignity accorded to all hegemony subjects." Mitchell's smile widened. "That's the thing about humans, Commander. We don't know how to quit. We don't have a surrender reflex. When you back us into a corner, we don't give up. We just stop caring about the consequences of our actions, and that makes us the most dangerous thing in this galaxy." She looked directly into his eyes, and Zeta-9 saw something there that made his alien psychology recoil in instinctive terror. It wasn't hatred or fear or even madness. It was a complete absence of self-preservation instinct, combined with an absolute determination to inflict maximum damage before dying. "You see, Commander, you made one critical error. You assumed that because we value life, we would surrender to preserve it. But humans have something that apparently no other species in the galaxy possesses. We can decide that some things are more important than staying alive. And once we make that decision, we become something you've never faced before. We become absolutely unstoppable." The explosion that followed destroyed not just the bunker, but 3 square miles of mountain around it. It was the largest non-nuclear blast in human history, and it served as a signal to every surviving human on Earth that the time for half measures was over. Part 2. De-escalation. In the aftermath of the NORAD incident, Zeta-9 made his first critical strategic error. He requested reinforcements. Within 72 hours, the hegemony's 2nd and 3rd fleets had arrived in Earth's solar system, bringing the total occupying force to just over 2 million troops across 600 ships. It was the largest single-world occupation force in hegemony history, deployed against a planet whose military had been completely destroyed in the opening hours of the invasion. Command Admiral Thek Prime, Zeta-9's superior, was confident that overwhelming force would finally break human resistance. "No species," he declared in his briefing to the combined fleet commanders, "can maintain asymmetric warfare indefinitely against superior numbers and technology. The humans will exhaust their resources, run out of weapons, and be forced to surrender within the next planetary rotation." The Admiral was wrong on every count. The humans weren't running out of weapons. They were making new ones. More disturbing still, they weren't just creating traditional armaments. They were weaponizing everything. Medical supplies became chemical weapons. Agricultural equipment became explosive devices. Children's toys became sophisticated surveillance and communication networks. In the ruins of Geneva, human scientists had established an underground laboratory where they were working around the clock to develop countermeasures to hegemony technology. They had no formal leadership, no chain of command, and no strategic coordination with other human groups. They worked together because they shared a common purpose: to make the occupation as costly as possible. Elena Vasquez, formerly a biochemist researching cancer treatments, had become the galaxy's most wanted terrorist. Her specialty was developing biological agents specifically designed to target alien physiology. She had no government backing, no military support, and no resources except what she could salvage from the wreckage of civilization. But she had something more valuable: the absolute focus that comes from having nothing left to lose. They keep trying to understand our psychology, she explained to her team of fellow refugees, all of whom were sleeping 4 hours a night and working the other 20 on increasingly exotic ways to kill their occupiers. They want to know what we're fighting for, what we hope to achieve, what we expect to gain from our resistance. They don't understand that we're not fighting for anything anymore. We're fighting because fighting is what we are. Her words proved prophetic. Across the globe, humans were developing what military historians would later term extinction warfare. Combat doctrines based on the assumption that the defender's society had already ended and that the only remaining goal was to inflict maximum casualties on the enemy before being eliminated. In the ruins of Moscow, former software engineers had hacked into the city's remaining infrastructure and were using it to coordinate strikes against hegemony forces. They had turned every security camera, every traffic sensor, every automated system into part of a vast surveillance network that could track alien movements across the entire metro area. When hegemony forces tried to shut down the network by destroying the data centers, they discovered that the humans had already anticipated this move. The network was distributed across thousands of personal devices, each one programmed to automatically mesh with nearby systems. Destroying one node only made the network stronger by forcing it to adapt and evolve. But the real nightmare for the occupation forces began when the humans started coordinating their efforts on a global scale. It started with something called the Dead Man's Protocol, a communication system that had been established by human survivors in the opening days of the invasion. The system was brilliant in its simplicity. Any human who made contact with other survivors was to immediately share everything they had learned about alien tactics, weaknesses, and technology. Information flowed freely between resistance cells, but operational security was maintained by keeping individual groups small and isolated. The result was a form of distributed intelligence that the hegemony had never encountered. Every lesson learned by one resistance cell would rapidly spread to every other cell on the planet. Every successful tactic would be copied and improved upon by thousands of independent groups. Every alien weakness discovered in Beijing would be exploited in Berlin within hours. Admiral Thek Prime began to realize the scale of the problem when his casualty reports started arriving. In the first week after reinforcements arrived, the combined fleet had lost more troops than in the previous 6 months of operations. The humans weren't just fighting harder, they were fighting smarter. The learning curve was exponential. Attacks that had been crude and desperate in the early days of the occupation were evolving into sophisticated operations that seemed to anticipate hegemony countermeasures. Human tactics that should have been easy to defeat once analyzed were constantly adapting and improving. Most disturbing of all was the psychological profile that hegemony intelligence was building of human resistance fighters. According to every established model of insurgency warfare, resistance movements required hope to sustain themselves. Fighters needed to believe that their actions could lead to eventual victory, that their sacrifices served a larger purpose, that their cause was just and attainable. The humans had none of these things. They knew they couldn't win. They knew they were going to die. They knew that their planet was doomed and their species was facing extinction. And they kept fighting anyway, with an intensity that actually seemed to increase as their situation became more hopeless. This psychological profile was so far outside the normal parameters that Hegemony Command refused to believe it until they captured and interrogated several human fighters. The first was a teenager named Marcus Chen, captured during a raid on a Hegemony supply depot. Under interrogation, he displayed none of the behavioral patterns typical of captured insurgents. He wasn't trying to protect information or buy time for his compatriots to escape or negotiate for better treatment. He was completely forthcoming about his group's activities, their methods, and their goals. "We're going to keep killing you," he told his interrogators with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing the weather. We're going to keep killing you until you kill all of us. And when you've killed all of us, we'll have made sure that every other species in the galaxy knows exactly what it costs to attack humanity. When asked what he hoped to accomplish with this strategy, Marcus looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Accomplish? We're not trying to accomplish anything. We're already dead. We died the day you showed up. Now we're just making sure you remember why you should never, ever attack another species the way you attacked us. The interrogation records were forwarded to Hegemony High Command, where xenopsychologists struggled to understand what they were reading. The concept of a species that would continue fighting without hope of victory was so alien to their understanding of rational behavior that many assumed the intelligence was faulty. They changed their minds when similar reports started arriving from interrogation centers across the planet. Dr. James Wu, former professor of physics at MIT, captured while planting improvised nuclear devices in a hegemony command center. You want to know our endgame? Simple. We want every other species in the galaxy to know that humans don't surrender. Ever. We want them to know that attacking us means fighting until one side or the other is completely extinct. Maria Santos, former nurse captured after single-handedly killing 12 hegemony soldiers with stolen medical equipment. My children are dead. My husband is dead. Everyone I ever loved is dead. I don't want anything anymore except to make sure that you pay the maximum possible price for what you've done. The pattern was consistent across hundreds of interrogations. The humans weren't fighting for territory, or freedom, or political goals. They were fighting for something that hegemony psychology couldn't quite grasp, the right to make their destroyers pay for destroying them. But it was the testimony of Colonel Rebecca Torres that finally made High Command understand what they were truly facing. Torres had been captured while defending a refugee camp that was home to nearly 3,000 human survivors. Her unit had held off a hegemony assault force for 4 days using nothing but small arms and improvised explosives. When they were finally overrun, she was the only defender left alive. Under interrogation, she was asked the standard questions about human command structure, resource allocation, and strategic objectives. Her answers revealed the true scope of what the hegemony was dealing with. Command structure? We don't have one. We're not an army, or a government, or an organization. We're a force of nature. Resource allocation? Every human on this planet is a resource. And we're all allocated to the same mission, making you regret coming here. Strategic objectives? Complete mutual annihilation. The interrogator, a seasoned intelligence officer who had broken resistance fighters from dozens of species, pressed for more conventional information. What were the humans trying to achieve? What were their victory conditions? What would they accept as terms for surrender? Torres leaned back in her restraints and smiled, the same expression that had become the stuff of nightmares for hegemony ground troops. You still don't get it. Humans don't have victory conditions because humans don't expect to win. We have something much simpler. We have a promise. Every human on this planet has made the same promise, and we're going to keep it even if it kills every last one of us. What promise? That you'll never be the same after fighting us. That every time your species encounters another world, another species, you'll remember what happened here. You'll remember what it costs to push a species past the point where they care about their own survival. You'll remember that there are some lines you should never cross and some enemies you should never make. Torres was executed 3 hours later, but her final words were included in every intelligence report that reached Hegemony High Command. We're not trying to defeat you. We're trying to traumatize you. And it's working. Admiral Thek Prime realized she was right. His forces were beginning to show signs of what human military psychologists would have recognized as combat stress reaction. Elite soldiers who had conquered dozens of worlds were becoming reluctant to leave their ships. Veteran commanders were requesting transfers away from Earth. Entire units were reporting equipment failures rather than acknowledge that they were too psychologically damaged to continue fighting. The humans had found a way to weaponize hopelessness itself. Part 3. The reckoning. By the 6th month of occupation, the hegemony controlled exactly 0% of Earth's surface during nighttime hours. Admiral Thek Prime stared at the tactical display showing real-time control maps of the conquered planet and found himself facing a military impossibility. His forces held every major population center, every strategic resource site, every transportation hub, and every communication facility on the planet. According to every metric used to measure successful occupation, Earth was completely pacified. But the moment darkness fell, the planet belonged to the humans. They emerged from sewers, subway tunnels, abandoned buildings, forest caves, and 1,000 other hiding places with the patience of natural predators. They struck with surgical precision against isolated targets, then melted back into the urban ruins and wilderness before any response could be organized. They had become nocturnal hunters, and the night was their domain. The psychological impact on hegemony forces was becoming catastrophic. Soldiers trained to fight conventional armies found themselves stalked by an enemy that seemed to materialize from the shadows themselves. Elite units that had never retreated from any battlefield began refusing night patrol duties. Equipment worth billions of credits sat unused because crews were too terrified to maintain it after dark. High Command's response was predictable: overwhelming force applied with mechanical precision. If humans owned the night, the hegemony would eliminate night itself. Orbital bombardment platforms began systematic destruction of any area where human activity was detected. Atmospheric processes were deployed to fill Earth's air with chemical agents that would force humans to reveal themselves. Entire city blocks were leveled based on the slightest evidence of resistance activity. The campaign was devastatingly effective. Human casualties climbed from thousands to hundreds of thousands to millions. Resistance cells were destroyed faster than they could be replaced. The planet's infrastructure was reduced to radioactive rubble. Within 90 days, Earth's surface was a toxic wasteland barely capable of supporting life. It should have ended the resistance. Instead, it unleashed something far worse. The humans who survived the Scorched Earth campaign were no longer the same species that had initially been invaded. They were the ones who had adapted fastest to living underground, who had developed immunity to the chemical agents, who had learned to thrive in conditions that would kill most life forms. They were the ones who had already lost everything and everyone they had ever cared about. They were the ones who had nothing left but anger. Dr. Sarah Kim had once been Seoul National University's leading expert on nanotechnology. Now she was the galaxy's most wanted war criminal, responsible for developing microscopic weapons that could disassemble hegemony equipment at the molecular level. She worked from a laboratory carved out of bedrock 3 kilometers beneath what had once been South Korea, surrounded by a team of fellow academics who had transformed their expertise in medicine, chemistry, and engineering into increasingly exotic ways to kill their enemies. They think they can break us by making our world uninhabitable, she explained to the latest group of refugees who had found their way to her underground facility. They don't understand that they've just eliminated our last reason to show restraint. We were holding back because we wanted to preserve something of our civilization. Now that there's nothing left to preserve, we can focus entirely on destruction. Her words were being echoed in similar facilities around the globe. Human survivors had established a vast underground network that spanned the planet's crust like an infection. They had no centralized leadership, no unified strategy, and no communication with each other beyond the dead man's protocol. But they shared a common purpose that had been refined down to its essential core: make the aliens pay the maximum possible price for every meter of poisoned ground, they claimed. The weapons emerging from these underground laboratories were unlike anything in the hegemony's experience. Human scientists, freed from ethical constraints and legal limitations, had begun developing technologies that violated several galactic conventions on warfare. Self-replicating nanobots that could eat through ship armor, biological weapons that targeted specific alien genetic markers, chemical agents that could remain dormant for decades before activating. Most disturbing were the psychological weapons. Human resistance fighters had become experts at exploiting alien mental vulnerabilities, developing tactics specifically designed to cause maximum trauma to enemy forces. They would leave hegemony soldiers alive but crippled, forcing their comrades to listen to their suffering over communication channels. They would plant evidence suggesting that trusted alien officers were actually human collaborators. They would stage elaborate false flag operations designed to turn different hegemony species against each other. The resistance had become a cancer that was metastasizing throughout the occupying force, spreading paranoia, distrust, and psychological breakdown faster than any conventional weapon could have managed. But it was the emergence of the final protocol that finally convinced Hegemony High Command that Earth was unwinnable. The final protocol was simple in concept and absolutely terrifying in implementation. If human resistance ever reached a critical threshold of failure, if the extinction of their species became inevitable, they would trigger a planet-wide self-destruct sequence that would take as many aliens as possible along with them. The humans had spent months secretly rigging Earth's entire nuclear arsenal, along with every chemical plant, power station, and fuel depot on the planet, into a single massive explosive device. The trigger was distributed across hundreds of dead man switches carried by resistance leaders around the globe. If enough of them were killed, or if human population levels dropped below a predetermined threshold, the entire planet would become a nuclear fireball, visible from neighboring star systems. The plan wasn't just to deny Earth to the hegemony, it was to create a monument to human defiance that would be studied by xenoarchaeologists for millennia. Every species in the galaxy would know that humanity's final act had been to choose mutual annihilation rather than surrender. When Admiral Thek Prime received intelligence confirming the final protocol, he found himself facing a strategic paradox that had no solution. He could not win by conquering the planet because the humans would detonate it rather than surrender. He could not win by withdrawing because that would demonstrate to the entire galaxy that the hegemony could be defeated by sufficient resistance. And he could not win by negotiating because the humans had made it clear they would accept no terms except complete alien withdrawal. For the first time in hegemony history, they had encountered an enemy that could not be defeated because it refused to be defeated. The final straw came when human resistance fighters launched their most audacious operation yet, a coordinated assault on the hegemony's orbital command center. Using stolen shuttles, improvised weapons, and tactics that bordered on suicidal, they fought their way through 3 layers of security to reach the station's command deck. The battle lasted 18 hours and resulted in the complete destruction of the orbital facility, along with every human involved in the assault. But before they died, the resistance fighters transmitted a message that was broadcast across every communication channel in the system. The message was simple, delivered by a young woman whose face was streaked with blood, and whose eyes held the absolute certainty of someone who had already accepted death. To every alien species watching this transmission, this is what happens when you attack humanity. This is what we become when you threaten our families, our homes, our freedom. We don't surrender. We don't negotiate. We don't compromise. We adapt, we escalate, and we make you pay until you decide that fighting us costs more than leaving us alone. She paused, looking directly into the camera with an expression that would haunt alien nightmares for generations. We are not the strongest species in the galaxy. We are not the smartest or the fastest or the most advanced, but we are something none of you are. We are the species that would rather die fighting than live kneeling, and that makes us the most dangerous force in the universe. The transmission ended with the sound of explosions as the command center's self-destruct charges detonated, taking the entire facility and everyone on it out of existence. Within 48 hours, Hegemony High Command issued the order for complete withdrawal from the Sol system. Earth was officially designated as a Category 5 hostile environment, approach prohibited. It was the first time in over 3,000 years that the hegemony had abandoned a conquest operation. But the effects of the human war rippled far beyond Earth's solar system. Within a year, 3 different client species had successfully revolted against hegemony rule using tactics learned from studying human resistance methods. The idea that a sufficiently determined species could make occupation impossible had spread throughout the galaxy like a virus, undermining the psychological foundations of hegemony power. The Kronak, who had served as the hegemony's primary shock troops for centuries, began experiencing what their military psychologists termed human syndrome, a form of combat stress reaction triggered by facing enemies who showed no self-preservation instinct. Entire units became combat ineffective after experiencing the kind of asymmetric warfare that humans had perfected. Other species began developing human protocols, military doctrines specifically designed to avoid creating the conditions that had turned Earth into a planetary nightmare. The galaxy's major powers began establishing formal rules of engagement that included provisions for recognizing when a species had entered human mode and procedures for immediate disengagement. Most significantly, humanity's reputation spread far beyond the military sphere. The story of Earth's resistance became a legend that was told on worlds throughout the galaxy, usually in whispered tones around late-night gatherings. Humans became synonymous with a particular kind of courage that most species couldn't even comprehend: the courage to keep fighting when defeat was certain. When the first human colony ship left the devastated Earth 50 years later, it was met not with hostility, but with a kind of awed respect. The ship's captain, Admiral Chen Wei, grandson of Marcus Chen, the teenager who had died in hegemony captivity, was invited to speak before the Galactic Council about humanity's plans for expansion into the wider galaxy. His speech was brief and to the point. Humanity seeks peaceful coexistence with all galactic species. We want trade, cultural exchange, and mutual cooperation. But if any species ever again makes the mistake of threatening human freedom or human lives, they will discover that we have learned nothing from our occupation except how to fight harder and die more expensively. The Council voted unanimously to grant humanity full sovereign rights to any system they chose to colonize. The vote was not based on respect for human technology, or admiration for human culture, or fear of human military power. It was based on something much simpler: the absolute certainty that humanity was the one species in the galaxy that would never, under any circumstances, accept defeat. In the end, that was enough. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Humanity had learned this lesson in the hardest way possible, and in learning it, they had taught the galaxy something that would never be forgotten. There are some enemies you should never make, some lines you should never cross, and some species you should never, ever try to conquer. The humans had paid for this lesson with their world, their civilization, and billions of lives. But they had learned it completely, and they had made sure that no other species would ever have to learn it the same way. In the ruins of Earth, automated beacons still broadcast the same message that had been transmitted during the final days of the occupation. We are humanity. We do not surrender. We do not yield. We do not forget. And we do not forgive. Remember this and choose your enemies wisely. The beacons had been broadcasting for over 50 years now, and they would continue broadcasting until the sun burned out. They served as both a monument to human defiance and a warning to any species that might consider making the same mistake the hegemony had made. No one had ever tried to shut them off. No one ever would.